Thank you so very much, and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I'm delighted to share with you some additional information about what's new with strengthening families by pulling out some key ideas from this new report related to the strengthening families values and expanded definitions of the protective factors. As you can see, the title of this new report is Expanding the Perspectives and Research Foundation for the Strengthening Families and Youth Thrive Frameworks. And a key word in that title is expanding, because the information described in the report builds on and broadens our knowledge about the challenges that children, parents, and families face, and builds on and broadens our knowledge about more comprehensive ways to promote healthy development and well-being. So let's just dive right in. As Neelofer mentioned, the CSSP introduced the Strengthening Families approach and Protective Factors framework in 2003. During the 20 years since its introduction, many things have changed in our society that present both challenges and causes for hope and optimism. For example, studies show that some of the positive aspects, if we look at this next slide, studies show that some of the positive aspects of the changing societal landscape include, all of these new technological advances, increased volunteerism, more acceptance of diverse racial, ethnic, gender, and sexual identities, and increased consciousness about environmental issues. But in addition to the positive changes over the last 20 years, the landscape of challenges facing families has changed significantly, in that we have experienced, even recently, major threats to health, like this global pandemic. If we can go to the next slide, there have been increased burdens on families, such as the rising costs of housing, yet family incomes have not risen significantly. We've experienced changing social norms. We are even at a point in 2024 talking about banning books, particularly about racial and LGBTQ identities. And there are even some new discriminatory laws, like transgender people being denied access to gender affirming medical care. These challenges come with a difficult price for many children, youth, and families. For example, in 2021, the United States Surgeon General stated that the challenges today's generation of young people face are unprecedented and uniquely hard to navigate. And the effect that these challenges have had on their mental health is devastating. All of that was true even before the COVID-19 pandemic dramatically altered young people's experiences at home, at school, and in the community. And not just the young people, but adults' experiences as well. The pandemic era's unfathomable number of deaths, but families have not experienced these national challenges equally. Studies show that young people who are members of historically marginalized identity groups, based on whether it's based on race or ethnicity, gender identity, economic circumstances, geographic location, like living in rural areas, all of these kinds of marginalized identity groups tend to fare worse than others. For instance, if you look at this, during the COVID-19 pandemic, children in households with lower incomes lost access to free school lunches, and therefore hunger increased in certain areas. Asian American youth experienced increased stress due to COVID-19 related blame and harassment and attacks. 56% of LGBTQ youth reported that their mental health was poor most of the time or always. Indigenous youth had the highest rates of depression, and Black and Latina youth had the greatest increases in the proportion of youth experiencing suicidal ideation. You may be saying to yourself, but that was 2021. That was 3 years ago. The pandemic is over. So what does that have to do with now? Now, while the pandemic may be over, the data continue to tell us that its lingering effects have not fully passed. And so, in my efforts to understand more about what's happening in families today and how to address these challenges, I remembered a poetic statement that says, when a flower doesn't bloom, you fix the environment in which it grows, not the flower. For me, that means that sometimes when people are experiencing challenges or traumatic events, as we see on the next slide, we try to fix them. We try to fix the symptoms of the problems that they are facing instead of working to address or fix the root causes, the conditions, or the circumstances that contribute to their poor outcomes. And so I started asking myself, have we, and by we, I mean the strengthening families, folks who are committed to strengthening families, have we said enough about what's necessary to strengthen families, to build resilient families? Have we focused enough on the environments in which children and families live and learn and work and play? Or have we just been focusing on fixing them and their symptoms? So these questions led me to revisit the core values of the Strengthening Families approach that describe the standards for implementing strengthening families. Most of these values have always been implicit in the discussion of strengthening families, but it became clear that we needed to expand on these values, on the existing values, and make them more explicit in our trainings and in our discussions about the protective factors. And so you see here, we expanded our pursue equity and justice for all children, youth, and families, recognize and respond to oppression and privilege, demonstrate cultural responsiveness, cultural humility, and intellectual humility, and employ a social ecological approach. Now, I want to look at each one of those very briefly. We all know what the strength-based perspective refers to, in that if you are strengthening families advocate, you understand that all individuals, and you appreciate the fact that all individuals have intrinsic value and existing assets that can be identified and mobilized to improve their quality of life. We operate from that perspective. But then we move not only to operating in a strength-based perspective, but incorporating an intersectional frame of reference. Now, most often we think of intersectionality as referring to multiple identities that people have. If we could go to the next slide. Multiple identities that individuals have. So that, and we need to talk about an intersectional frame because children, parents, and families have a wide variety of experiences and needs. And so when we have an intersectional frame, when we take an intersectional frame of reference, we can see them in a broader context. We can respond to a broader, more inclusive understanding of the experiences and specific needs that they have. The next value that we elevate is amplifying constituent voice and power. Within the Strengthening Families frameworks, parents are regarded as resources, not just people who are receiving services, but as resources who deserve a voice in defining their own needs, their goals, hopes, and future aspirations, as well as they deserve a voice in shaping the programs and the policies and the systems that impact their lives, their families' lives, and the collective interests of their peers. Strengthening Families emphasizes, though, that even though we underscore the importance of parent voice, we also say that parent voice is insufficient without a shift in power dynamics. So parent voice also needs to be met with parent power. That, and when I say power, parent power, we are talking about equal access to the resources and equal opportunity to resources and equal opportunity to direct influence over the lives and circumstances of their families and their communities. The next value is pursuing equity and justice for all children, youth, and families. We see this value not just as a value, but as an ethical obligation. If you are honestly, truly committed to strengthening families, then you have an ethical obligation to pursue the equitable and just treatment of those families, of all the children, youth, parents, and families that you serve. But looking at this value goes hand in hand with the next value. And so the obligation to pursue equity and justice is an implicit acknowledgement that we must also recognize and respond to oppression and privilege. We cannot honestly or completely pursue the equitable and just treatment of children, parents, and families if we don't face up to the fact that some individuals, some families, and some communities have been unfairly advantaged by various laws and systems and ideologies, while others have been unfairly disadvantaged. If we don't face up to that fact, don't acknowledge that fact, and then respond to that, then we are not really honestly interested in pursuing equity and justice. Those two things go hand in hand. The brilliant writer James Baldwin, and the reason that I emphasize this goes back to a statement that James Baldwin made that I always want to cite. That James Baldwin said that not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it's faced. So if we are talking about pursuing the equitable and just treatment of children, parents, and families, then we have to be truly committed to recognizing and responding to oppression and privilege. The next value relates to culture. And so we say, and we label it as demonstrate cultural responsiveness, cultural humility, and intellectual humility. In other words, this means that strengthening families practitioners should demonstrate respect for cultural differences, engage in self-reflection about their own attitudes toward different identity groups, and learn from others' experiences and perspectives. At the core of this value is the need to have a deep understanding of culture rather than limiting it to our understanding, rather than limiting our understanding of culture to just the styles of music, dance, food, and dress that we see in different cultures. The Strengthening Families team has always acknowledged that the 5 protective factors are universal and that they describe characteristics and conditions that are essential for the real well-being of all children, parents, and families. But we've also acknowledged that the 5 protective factors may be understood and manifested in culturally specific ways. And so we need to know about the culturally specific ways in which resilience is manifest, in which social connections are manifest, etc. Now, looking at the next slide, I want to venture off for just a minute. In general, the Strengthening Families protective factors are characteristics and conditions that serve these 4 essential purposes: maximizing people's potential by building their competencies and relationships and resources that promote healthy development and well-being, reducing the likelihood of engaging in destructive behaviors, lessening the effect or the impact of exposure to risk factors and trauma, helping individuals negotiate challenging circumstances, identify proactive solutions, and fare better in school and life and work. Now, we say these are the primary purposes of the protective factors, but research and practice have shown that individuals' racial and ethnic culture significantly contributes to these purposes. people have asked us over the years, why don't you have culture as the sixth protective factor? Well, this is what we believe. We conceive culture as an overarching protective factor that influences each of the strengthening family's protective factors. That's why cultural responsiveness is so very important. Culture influences how resilience is conceived. What we mean when people say managing stress and functioning well, that's culturally influenced. Culture influences the nature and types of social connections that we make and how you make them. Culture influences what knowledge and how knowledge is acquired. And culture influences the expression of social and emotional competence, and even influences the type of concrete support that is sought and provided. Now, I need to say that when we talk about culture, I'm talking about all racial and ethnic groups have a unique collective culture, not just those who are typically labeled as minority groups or historically marginalized groups. Every group of people have a culture. So what is culture? I was drawn to a definition of culture that you may not have seen before because it grows out of research on Native American culture. But although it specifically refers to Native American groups, I think it is generalizable to all racial and ethnic groups. And I'll just pause and read this. Culture for Native Americans is not about esteem, taste, or music, but rather is a cognitive map on how to be. Culture can be thought of as all the things and all the ways in which Native people understand who they are, where they come from, and how to interact with others. Native Americans learn these principles where? From their family and from their community. I submit that every culture provides its members an understanding of how to be through direct or indirect or vicarious experiences that they teach shared values, beliefs, behaviors, language, history, all of that. And this is an example. This is an example that relates to another point that we need to make. White children in the United States learn how to be, go back for me, please. White children in the United States learn how to be in a context which centers their race as the norm within the larger society. However, Black, Indigenous, Latina, and Asian American children learn how to be in a context that may center their race or ethnicity within their own community, but not in the larger society. They also learn how to be in a context of the possibility or the actual experience of racism and discrimination. Now, I know in some spaces we're not supposed to talk about this, but I'm going to give you two examples anyway. Now we can look at this next example. One of the effects of racism is that different racial and ethnic groups tend to have different experiences and reactions to the same events. This is a cartoon that was published in a newspaper several years ago. And it was developed by a guy named Ben Sargent, who is a white cartoonist. And he labeled this Steel to Americas. And he drew it to illustrate the racial differences that still occur today. And so here we have on the left side, a little kid that's drawn as a white child saying, "I'm going out, Mom." And Mom responds simply, "Put on your jacket." You have a similarly aged Black child that says, "I'm going out, Mom." And she responds by saying, "Putting on your jacket, keep your hands in sight at all times. Don't make sudden moves. Keep your mouth shut around police. Don't run. Don't wear a hoodie. Don't give them any excuse to hurt you." Now, I can relate to this, and I think there are others that should be able to relate to this, because this shows how Black parents, how Black children and families are still trapped in the horror of the possibility of their children, their youth, their themselves stepping outside and suffering consequences, even when they don't do anything, as contrasted with others. Another example is something in the research that's called adultification bias. These images here illustrate this phenomenon called adultification bias. In many societies, children are viewed as a distinct developmental group characterized by innocence and in need of protection. But studies have found that these perceptions are not often ascribed to Black, Indigenous, or Latina youth and children. These children are viewed as older and therefore should be held more accountable for their actions than their same age white peers. Adultification bias occurs when adults, in particular authority figures such as social workers, educators, judges, school resource officers in particular, have distorted perceptions and expectations of Black, Indigenous, and Latina children and youth. And so there are several different reports that provide data. We see just a few examples on the next slide about that's suggestive of adultification bias. I won't go through all of this, but I want to highlight an example that actually appeared in a newspaper. And so what happens in adultification bias is when you see these Black, Indigenous, Latina children and youth as being older, they tend to be viewed as intentionally malicious, rather in what they do, rather than their behavior being a result of decision-making skills that are still developing. And so what happens is that instead of responding to them with sensitivity to their needs and developmentally appropriate supportive services, and so this example here that was in a newspaper just really boldly highlights adultification bias. And this is just an excerpt from that article. It says, on January 31st, 2020, police in Rochester, New York, released body camera video showing officers restraining a 9-year-old Black girl. And in my understanding of development, 9 years old is still a child. Restraining a 9-year-old Black girl in handcuffs, pepper spraying her, and pushing her into the cold snow. At one point, and this is the adultification bias. At one point, the officer demanded that the young girl stop acting like a child, because he didn't see her like that. The 9-year-old girl responded saying, "I am a child." Okay. So now, with all of this, from culture to this, you may be wondering, what does all of this have to do with the strengthening families protective factors? Numerous professional organizations like the American Academy of Pediatrics and the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry would suggest that these examples have everything to do with the protective factors. These professional medical and mental health organizations have declared racism to be a significant threat to child and family well-being, which makes it a public health matter. This is not just a social matter, this is a public health matter. For example, a policy statement issued by the American Academy of Pediatrics, which I would strongly suggest that you read the whole report, indicated that racism is a social determinant of health that has a profound impact on the health status of children, adolescents, emerging adults, and their families. Failure to address racism will continue to undermine health equity for all children, adolescents, emerging adults, and their families. So that's that's what it has to do with the protective factors. In addition, Harvard University, the Center on the Developing Child at Harvard University, and other research institutes have investigated the impact of racism on child development. Yet, even with all of this information from these professional organizations and from these research institutes, rarely is racism a topic of focus in programs and interventions for children, youth, parents, and families. The fact that positive outcomes are still possible for many Black, Indigenous, Latina, and Asian American children, despite all of the negative impacts that racism can impose upon them. This speaks to the protective factors, such as social connections, social and emotional competence, resilience. It speaks to the protective factors that have surrounded them and that are facilitated by the strength and protective nature of the messages and experiences that many of these children receive in their family and in their cultural context. So studies have found that a strong sense of racial and ethnic identity, and by that I mean having positive beliefs and feelings about your racial or ethnic group, irrespective of how your group is perceived in public, in larger society, that strong sense of racial and ethnic identity can protect against or reduce the negative effects of racism-related stress and discrimination. That's part of this whole protective factor stuff. A sense of connectedness with your own cultural group can enhance your sense of self, self-esteem, etc. And so in expanding our understanding about these protective factors, we emphasize that authentic and effective engagement with children, parents, and families requires, among many things, among all the other things, a consideration of and responsiveness to their cultural beliefs and values and to their individual and collective experiences of racism, sexism, homophobia, all of that. We have to consider all of that when we're talking about protective factors. And so with all of these concerns, researchers have concluded that promoting the health and well-being of children requires extending interventions beyond the family or individual levels. In other words, risk and protective factors have to be considered beyond the four walls of parenting to embrace the social, economic, and political forces that affect families and communities. And so our seventh value, our seventh strengthening families value, is the need to employ a social ecological approach. That is, considering factors across all levels of the social ecology, not just the individual level, not just the family level. Our expanded values resulted in the need to expand our definitions of the protective factors. And so I want to look at each one of the protective factors briefly and with particular attention to the notion, the factor called resilience. Okay. So let's start with social connections. We now see social connections, define it as, this is not a significant change to the end of this sentence, as healthy, meaningful, trusting, and sustained relationships with people, institutions, communities, or a higher power that promote a sense of connectedness, of belonging, and mattering. I cannot underscore the importance of people having a sense of, I cannot overemphasize, that's what I meant to say, the importance of people having a sense of belonging, feeling that they are welcome and accepted as a part of their environment, or that they matter, perceiving that other people are concerned about, appreciate them and are concerned about what happens to them, and also believing that they can contribute to other people. Some other in the report, we also, under social connections, talk about this idea of early relational health and how important it is to build this strong emotional connection between young children and their caregivers by exposing them to attentive, responsive, nurturing interactions. And we also in the article talk about community connectedness under this topic. And because we now say we really can't talk about individuals and families without talking about their communities, the communities that they thrive, that they live in. So we need to focus on community issues, healthy, protective relationships between individuals and their key environments, like their neighborhoods and social organizations, etc. The next one, knowledge of parenting and child development. In this definition, you'll see a new aspect of development that we have not mentioned, had not really focused on before. We may have mentioned it, but not really focused in on it. So we are saying that knowledge of parenting and child development, the expanded definition is learning about prenatal, that's the new developmental period, infant and child development, and using developmentally and contextually appropriate parenting practices. You did not hear, we are not saying best practices. We're saying developmentally and contextually appropriate parenting practices. That has to be considered. One of the reasons that we really place so much attention on prenatal development, their values, their practices, and the behaviors, child behaviors they consider to be appropriate or inappropriate. Another construct that we mentioned under this topic is this thing called good enough parenting. We don't have, just like strengthening families is not a model, a single model that you have to follow in this very scripted way, that there are multiple ways that you can implement strengthening families. There is no one way of being of parenting. And so we talk about good enough parenting. I am so relieved I'm so happy, and I wish I had known this 37 years ago with my own son, that to be just a good enough parent, not just not trying to ask myself constantly, am I doing the right thing? Am I doing the right thing? Now, good enough parenting does not mean mediocre parenting. We're talking about making efforts to be reflective and responsible and make reflective and responsible decisions that meet a child's current needs and guides them toward a healthy, productive life based on your personal, family, or cultural standards. This allows us to make mistakes and take corrective action. Good enough parenting. And then we also, in this under the context of knowledge of parenting, child development, focus on positive childhood experiences, how important those are. That relates to, the HOPE framework. Because the HOPE framework has shown us that experiences in childhood that build a child's sense of connectedness, belonging, mattering, that this was very much related to their positive outcomes, including success in school and good health. So having positive childhood experiences can help to offset some of the negative experiences that children may have. And then social and emotional competence, which in this context, the expanded definition reads providing environments and experiences grounded in early relational health that build positive social skills, enable children to regulate their thoughts, emotions, and behaviors, and promote effective communication, problem solving, and decision-making skills. And so under this factor in the paper, we emphasize the importance of self-advocacy, helping children, youth, family, and parents realistically represent themselves, their views, their interests. We need to ask children about what they want. And that doesn't mean that they have to do everything that they want, but they have some choices, they have some views, and we need to know what those are and some goals. Also under this topic, there's a discussion about racial socialization. And by that, we're talking about the process through which ideas and values and norms regarding race and ethnicity and racism are actually transmitted. The nature of children's racial socialization will influence their perceptions of other people of different racial groups and influence how they interact with this. And we really have to talk about racial socialization beyond this colorblind, treat everybody the same, race is no longer an issue messages. It is still an issue. And I'm not just saying that. Many professional organizations and research foundations are saying it. And then the fourth one, concrete support. And notice that we sort of took the ending off this. We just say concrete support rather than concrete support in times of need. And by concrete support, we're talking about identifying, accessing, advocating for, and receiving high quality and equitable support, including the basic necessities everyone deserves and specialized services to address specific needs, and receiving those things in a way that promotes their dignity, that does not harm the dignity of the individuals that are receiving these services. And so under this heading, there's a discussion about the social determinants of health, the importance of systems and programs and sectors working together, collaborating, and this whole thing called collaborative goal setting. And so, and then finally, there's a great long discussion about redefining resilience. And I want to spend a little bit more time on this one. A long-standing common definition of resilience is positive adaptation despite adversity. Positive adaptation usually refers to adjustments that individuals make to cope with stress and adversity. But sometimes when others tell us to positively adapt despite adversity, what they really mean is positively adapt to the adversity. Let me give you a personal example. Many times, Black girls and Black women tend to experience disproportionately high levels of racism and sexism in school and discrimination in school and in the workplace compared to other groups. In response, we are often encouraged to develop thick skin and ignore our mistreatment in order to get along with others and be accepted by others. Yet the racist and the sexist and the discriminatory conditions don't change. No, they continue. Also, the definition positive adaptation despite adversity tends to suggest that resilience is situated within the individual and dependent upon whether the person has the inner strength to cope with difficult circumstances. And if they do not possess the personal strength or they do not put forth sufficient effort, then it's the person's fault for not being resilient or achieving positive outcomes. Thus, the original conception of resilience that I even wrote placed the locus of solutions and problems and the process of change entirely on the individual and exonerate communities and the larger society from the responsibility to deal with adverse social conditions. But given the feedback that we've received from parents and strengthening families thought partners, as well as an increasing number of resilience researchers, we no longer see resilience as an individual matter only. And so our expanded definition of resilience is managing stress and functioning well, facilitated by individual, relational, community, or societal factors when faced with stressors, adversity, or trauma. And so what I want to do is just look at each one of these levels just very, very quickly, because at each one of these levels, there are factors that can either facilitate resilience or impede resilience. Societal factors that facilitate resilience include social, political, economic, legal, health, and environmental factors like policies, practices, structural deficiencies in our society that, again, disadvantage some groups and advantage others. Those are factors that can facilitate or impede. The social policies that parents and families and their families need in order to become stronger, those are factors that can facilitate resilience at the societal level. At the community level, we're talking about recognizing and eliminating discriminatory policies, procedures, and practices in organizations and community contexts, and in order to create equitable access to power and to privilege and to opportunity. Community-based and local governments often make efforts to identify and address adverse community conditions. We can't just let them remain. We have to address these adverse community conditions like neighborhood violence and persistent poverty and unemployment. Those things need to be dealt with, not just left to fester. As it relates to relational factors, science confirms that positive relationships are essential in facilitating positive functioning in response to adversity and trauma. And so in relational factors, we are talking, and notice I'm not saying family, it's all kinds of relationships that people need. So when we talk about relational factors that facilitate resilience, we're talking about the presence and emotional support that healthy, caring, reliable people provide to other people. Pro-social engagement in safe and supportive institutions and organized activities, feeling connected, that sense of belonging, that sense of mattering to something that helps you to find meaning and hope, optimism, and value in your life. Those are all the things that facilitate resilience at the relational level. And then finally, at the individual level, most of the research on resilience has focused on identifying individual level characteristics and skills that promote resilience, like these executive function skills, problem solving, decision making skills, self-regulation skills. This is the one we know most about. But it cannot be the only one that we focus on. So how do we know when resilience has been facilitated and resilience is going on? There's no single way that resilience can be displayed. It's, again, influenced by the individuals, families, cultures, values, and ways of knowing. But within this context, resilience can be reflected in multiple ways, like having more equitable experiences, having more access to opportunities and resources that promote well-being, reducing or eliminating the root causes of adverse conditions. And also, we can see it in these last two on this list: personal growth and resistance to oppressive or traumatic experiences. Those are the two that I want to focus on a bit. That personal growth is often referred to as post-traumatic growth because resilience is always in response to some kind of adversity. So as people encounter adversity and trauma, sometimes they seek to reestablish balance in their lives. And so they may engage, and I'm emphasizing this does not always happen and is not always necessary to happen, that they may engage in a process of self-reflection and reevaluation to try to learn, what can I learn? What lessons can I take from this horrible experience or this challenging experience? And so they can achieve positive change as a result of their efforts to cope with or move beyond the challenges and adversity they may be experiencing. So if and when that positive change occurs, that's what is called post-traumatic growth. An increased appreciation for life. All of those things can be indicators of post-traumatic growth. Post-traumatic growth often takes time, and individuals may continue to experience distress as they're trying to achieve positive change. and as I said before, also not everyone who experiences trauma will experience post traumatic growth. I had to laugh um, at something that I was told about from a person in a particular state, the state I won't name, but she indicated that some people in their state who have discovered this construct called post-traumatic growth are using it to try to justify the quote unquote benefits of the 246 years of enslavement of African peoples. That's not post-traumatic growth. Just because we have come out of that experience, and most of us have come out in a pretty healthy way, that does not mean that that experience was necessary. Okay, so that's a misuse of the term. And then finally, we want to look at resistance as an act of resilience. Resistance often refers to different forms of pushing back against traumatic or oppressive experiences rather than adjusting to it. Now, remember the example that I gave about Black girls and women often being encouraged to ignore their mistreatment, the mistreatment they experience at school or work. Often a different response is to resist the mistreatment by speaking up, by demanding to be heard, and refusing to remain invisible. Resistance then should be viewed as a form of resilience that challenges adversity rather than adapting to adversity, such as standing up for yourself, standing up for your children, standing up for the groups with which you identify. And resistance is commonly thought of as pushing back against external forces, like taking action to leave an abusive relationship, being involved in movements for like climate change or against gun violence. But resistance can also mean pushing back against challenging internal forces. And one of the greatest recommendations of resisting challenging internal forces is to engage in self-care. Self-care. And that becomes so important for those of us that work in these contexts, working with families and children and youth and helping them and many times internalizing some of their problems. We got issues too, but then we have to deal with other people's issues. Self-care is so important in our fields of work. To paraphrase Audre Lorde, a poet and writer, Audre Lorde, caring for oneself is not self-indulgence. It is self-preservation. And that is an act of resilience. Taking care of yourself is an act of resilience. Go to sleep, go to bed, rest. Sometimes one of my most effective ways of getting to resilience is pulling the covers over my head and going to sleep and saying and doing the Scarlett O'Hara, I'll deal with that tomorrow. I just can't deal with it tonight. And overnight, stuff in my brain starts working on stuff, but I'm asleep, consciously asleep. Okay, so conclusion. Our early efforts to help parents and their families build or strengthen their resilience focused on characteristics and conditions at the individual or family level of the social ecology. The idea of identifying and addressing community and societal factors and helping families to strengthen or build their resilience has been, that idea has been minimized or ignored altogether in a lot of the old resilience research, but that's beginning to change. Increasingly, researchers and practitioners and parents themselves and y'all are saying that more attention must be paid to the structural deficiencies in our society, to community conditions, and to the social and organizational policies that families need to become stronger, more competent, function better in adverse situations, and ultimately change the adverse conditions for the better. My friend and colleague, Kaylin O'Connor, said it best when she proclaimed that we can't just keep expecting parents to overcome obstacle after obstacle after obstacle. At some point, we must not have so many obstacles. Thank you.